Command Point is sponsored by Crossfire Games. Use code CommandPoint25 at checkout to get 5% off your next purchase. Link in the description.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Command Point. Merry Christmas Eve, because it is the 11th day of Kill Team, and I'm joined here today by Ben, who's going to talk to us about Mandrakes. And Ben, you brought Mandrakes to the World Championships, and there were not a ton of Mandrake players. Yesterday on the 12 Days of Kill Team, we talked about Brood Brothers, and it is kind of a similar story where at the end of last edition, Mandrakes were like a very relevant, like kind of like near the top of the tiers type of team. New edition dropped, the hype died down a little bit, but they're still a pretty good team. So I'd love to hear your insights on them.
Yeah, hey there, Shane. Merry Christmas Eve to you as well. And yeah, this team, I think a little bit of what you're talking about, some of that comes from the box was really hard to find. It only came with the Night Lords, and then we got a whole new edition that dropped. So it was kind of hard for people to get their hands on them. Then the new edition dropped, and there's all the madness. Everyone's learning their new teams. So, I picked up Mandrakes at that time, and there's some really cool tricks with them. They're a really fun and engaging team, and I think players that would be picking this team up would really have a lot to sink their teeth into.
Yeah, and it's kind of an interesting thing because with the new rules for the factions, Mandrakes didn't change that much because they were released really late, but the game around them changed so much that it does still feel very different playing them. So I guess for the first question, I wanted to ask, like, for somebody that's getting into kill team or is picking a new kill team, and Mandrakes catch their eye, for you, somebody with a lot of Mandrake experience, can you just go over like what about that team appeals to you? Like, why do you think somebody should pick up Mandrakes, whether it's aesthetic or playstyle or a mixture of both?
Absolutely. So first of all, they have gorgeous models. So there's a lot to like from that. If you like painting fire effects and OSL and stuff like that, there's a lot to really like about the models themselves. But also from a lore and then a translated to the tabletop experience, they play really cagey. They feel like dark elves. They're very shifty. They like to stick to the shadows. There's a lot of movement shenanigans that they can do. They all have standardly good data sheets, so every model in and of itself is a threat. So there's a lot of elements that you can lean into for various matchups that will showcase their strength, showcase player strength and player flexibility. So I really like this team because there's so many options, not necessarily from a list building standpoint, which I know we'll get to, but just from a how they behave on the tabletop. You are constantly coming up with new solutions. There's constantly new threats to present, and there's ways to layer all of their abilities together. So it's a really complicated team that once you get everything working well together, feels really satisfying.
Awesome. Yeah, very good answer. I think that like kind of nails down the appeal of it. I always did like the kind of redundancy in the models, how they're all pretty good at shooting, they're all pretty good at melee. There's not too much of like like other teams, you'll have like a guy who just has a big sword and he can't shoot, but he's got a big sword and that's all he does.
Right.
Mandrakes are not like that. They're all able to do a little bit of both. One thing I wanted to touch on, for you when you were playing this team, and I don't know how much experience you had with them last ed. Fortunately, it's not a very different team nowadays. But what is something that when you were playing them originally, after a few games, like a light bulb went off, like something clicked for you that made you think like, oh wow, this team makes a lot more sense now. I wish I was doing it this way from the start. For like a new player, like what's a good piece of like level up advice for someone coming right in?
100%. Yeah, to touch on exactly what you just mentioned, a lot of teams have guy with big sword does guy with big sword things. And this team, every model, so real quick, there's 5 specialists and 4 warriors in the general composition. There's some fringe elements where you might swap one of the specialists for another warrior, but generally speaking, that's your standard configuration. It's a one box team. You're good to go. But although there's only 5 specialists on the team, every model does at least 2 things for the team, and those can be radically different. And the specialists often do 3 things. And that flexibility, both from what the models can do and what you need to game plan for as a player, is what really unlocks the potential for this team. So sometimes you're looking to take, okay, my Abyssal is my gunner operative. What he does is he moves and he shoots things. Well, he, like every other model on the team, has shadow passage. And so sometimes it's more relevant that you need to take that model and teleport him somewhere so that he can be doing attack op, or so that he can get a flank set up for a future turning point. There's a lot of elements like that where it's not just necessarily what the model has as the weapons on his datasheet, but other ways that you can creatively use them to still accomplish your game plan.
Very good, very good. Yeah. So next question, I've been asking people about their loadouts in terms of operative selection. You mentioned there's a little bit of maybe niche scenario where you might swap out a specialist for a warrior, but 99% of the time you're running that same list, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's going to be your 5 standard specialists and then 4 warrior operatives. There's some weird stuff, like I mentioned. Maybe if you're into a melee heavy team on a particular board that you don't like, and you are trying to hit that 10 wound break point where the warrior gets the 1 extra damage on their critical if they're within shadow, then maybe you're dropping one of the specialists like the Shade Weaver. But I really like the utility that the Shade Weaver has outside of just being the bus driver for the team. But the smoke grenade is really useful, and its ability to teleport somewhere and smoke itself off permanently for the rest of the game until he dies, which is hard to do if he's in smoke forever. There's tricks and elements like that that are more advantageous to hold on to and keep your opponent guessing than just having 1 crit damage sometimes. So yeah, generally speaking, it's a 1-box kill team, and you just are taking 4 warriors and 5 specialists.
Yeah, I mean, one of the most pure 1-box teams I think around.
Yeah.
So I guess in lieu of there not being a lot of operative choices, I haven't touched on this with most people because there's a lot of other stuff to talk about typically, but for Mandrakes, I guess, what do you like to do for equipment then? Because that's probably where some of the choices actually lie in the pregame.
Yeah, so the equipment, I get this question a lot. People want to know, hey, what are the equipment choices? And truthfully, there's a handful of good options that you kind of whittle down based on the matchup that you're looking at. So the Shadow Glyph for super conceal on anyone who's relevant once per turning point, that's super good. But there are definitely times where it's not relevant. If you're on Into the Dark and your opponent doesn't have Seek Light, you don't need to take the Shadow Glyph. Soul Gem for the 1-inch blast on somebody whenever relevant once per turn. That's super useful. It's great Into the Dark, but it can be super useful outside. And it's another one of these layered elements that stresses your opponent out. Like, hey, by the way, don't bunch up. Don't get too close to each other. I'll blast somebody. We'll talk, maybe about how not stellar the shooting is, but it's the threat. It's the idea that, oh, by the way, I can do this, can really start to wear your opponents down. I also love smoke grenades. They're just a fantastic piece of equipment. Ladders can be surprisingly useful. Even though we can teleport, we're really only teleporting like 1 guy per turn. And so if we need that verticality element, if we're trying to stress 1 flank with our gunner, but we're actually trying to move people to the other flank, maybe we need ladders to be able to get up and down the terrain. Things like the light barricades Into the Dark are pretty much an always must have. The heavy barricade Into the Dark, I don't take it on open because it's just too unwieldy, but on Into the Dark, sometimes you can get it positioned where you can get a nice little nook, or you can extend your shadow a little bit. Those are some of the things I'm keeping in mind. And then, of course, it all matters about what the opponent is as well. Are you taking chain snares against elites? Probably not. They're not going to be falling back from us. So
That makes a lot of sense. And I guess on the topic of pregame decisions, what are you typically looking at for tac ops and stuff?
Ooh, so this is a great one. And actually, Shane, we talked about this at Worlds when we were there. The gather surveillance tac op for the Mandrakes is really, really powerful. So similar to Commandos, if you are on Vulcus, if the enemy's territory has that tier 2 vantage in it, you can just teleport one of your guys up on top because the whole thing's heavy. You can teleport one of your guys up on top. He can't be charged because he's on a 28 mil base, and then they just hang out there and take pictures for the rest of the game. And sometimes that seems kind of weird because like you're giving up an operative to just secure your tac ops. But truthfully, if you've selected that as your primary op, that's like 9 points that you're
Yep.
guaranteeing.
Yeah, that's definitely
And
worth going down an operative.
yeah, exactly. And some of the strength of this is that it's not always that same operative that has to be put on that island out there doing his own thing. Sometimes he'll go up there, he'll take pictures round two, and then he needs to get a charge or needs to get a shot or something. You move somebody else to take his spot up there, and then they just pick up where he left off. So it's not even like the one guy is up there forever. It's just he's up there for a little bit until it makes sense for him not to be up there. So gather surveillance is a really strong one, but you're not always playing on focus. And so if you're on into the dark, I find gather surveillance is pretty difficult just because it's hard to push into your opponent's territory. And if they play cagey, you're never getting behind them, which means that you have to push through their line, which this team struggles to do. And then if you're playing into hordes, gather surveillance is hard because they out-activate you, in which case they're going to respond and probably punish any kind of positioning that you do to try to get that surveillance. So things like confirm kill or, of course, plant beacons. Those are the kinds of things that I'm looking at in those matchups. But if I had my way in every game, I'd be taking gather surveillance.
Nice. Yeah, I mean, I can speak a little bit from experience. I played against, shout out to Felipe from Chile. I played him at Worlds my first game, and he took gather surveillance against me. And I didn't even give him the top Volcus point, but he would always save his teleport for like the last activation to just boot back into my back line and do the action and then get 2 points. And it was like, wow, I don't know how to stop that.
Yep.
Really powerful little combo there. So, next question, I wanted to ask you kind of about like your general early game strategy. Like I guess like turn one and like early turn two until the point of the game basically where the violence kind of begins. What is your like? What are you trying to accomplish with your like staging and like your operatives?
Yeah. Okay. So turn one, specifically deployment in the last edition, was my favorite part of the game because I would say all the time that you can't win a game in deployment, but you can lose it. And so that's what I would always focus on is how to exploit the weaknesses in my opponent's deployment in order to further my own game plan and really get that tempo advantage. In the new edition, that's much, much harder to do. Alpha strikes usually get punished pretty painfully. So now, at least with the Mandrakes, what I'm looking to do is one of two things. Either A, represent true threat on one flank, usually one flank. I try to overload one side of the board. But what I do with that is I leave the Shade Weaver in close proximity to like 2 or 3 other operatives so that everyone can be within the 1-inch engagement range of the Shadow Portal so that I can threaten just driving this bus randomly somewhere else on the map. And so I can present a bunch of threat on one side and then teleport, up to like 4 models onto the other flank and be like, oh, actually, no, this is where we're going to be fighting. Oh, you tried to run from me. Oh, you tried to meet me head on. Sometimes it's a bunch of legionaries, and I'm like, actually, I don't want to fight them. I'm gonna go to the other side of the board and try to do stuff over there. So that's one thing I'm looking at. The other thing that I'm really trying to focus on is how to layer the Dirge Maw and the Night Fiend together because they have a lot of interaction with the opponent's ability to activate models. And so I'm trying to make sure that I'm juggling their threat ranges appropriately so that when my opponent goes to activate a key Alpha Strike model in turn 2, my Dirge Maw can do something about it. Or if there's a bunch of models that are trying to push through like a doorway on Into the Dark, for example, the Night Fiend, if that door is open, can potentially tag those guys and keep them from activating, giving me that initial response.
Very cool. Yeah, no, that sounds that makes a lot of sense. That checks out. So I wanted to ask you now if you could try to recall what, in your opinion, is like the flashiest play that you've pulled off with Mandrake. Something where you were just like in that moment, you were just convinced of how much you like this faction? Like something just a cool moment you've had when playing these guys.
Well, I think, yeah. So it's going to be my final game at Worlds. Shout out to Jonathan Solly, who was the Novitiates player at Worlds, the one and only with that beautiful conversion custom models. Stunning team. Great opponent as well. But in that game, like I was talking about, I was representing threat kind of on the left flank. And so he kind of did a cagey staging outside of the stronghold that was on the right side, but he didn't push into it. And this was transmission, I believe, as our last mission. And so I didn't want him to push into that stronghold because that's where my, like, quote unquote, my objective was. So he staged outside of it. And like 2 or 3 activations before the end of Turning Point 1, I took my Night Fiend. I didn't take the Shade Weaver over there, which is what I was threatening. I just took by himself the Night Fiend, teleported him behind the door. He was outside of an inch, so I wasn't in engagement range, but I wasn't visible when I teleported there. I was underneath the vantage, so I'm still within shadow. And then he would have to doorway fight me to fight through, but because of where I had positioned him, I tagged like 5 or 6 novitiates with the Harrowing Whispers ability. And so that was like his leader, a flamer, a duelist, the sniper. There were a bunch of like really key models over on that entire flank. And he, without rolling any dice, shut down that entire flank, because every model that then tries to activate over there, there's a 66% chance that they fail to activate. And so I really kind of messed up his flow, messed up his tempo for what he was trying to do just on that whole side of the board by putting one guy behind a door. And you know, he's a melee monster himself because he's got 5 attacks hitting on 3s with a power weapon. So no one wants to fight him, and he's locking down half the board by himself.
Yeah, that's always amazing. I had a moment like that when I played them for a little bit last edition, where I just threw my Night Fiend into like an Into the Dark room in range of like 5 Zangors, and they just one by one all failed to activate, and it just like won me the game.
Yeah.
Crazy.
Something I would say about this team is risk balance. You know, there's a bunch of things that are like, hey, this is probably going to work out for me, right? I hit on 3s, I'm lethal 5, 4, 6 damage. I'm probably going to get a crit. There's a lot of things like that with this team. I think, in general, that is rewarding and feels good, and you can like play to your statistical outs. But there are definitely times where you're just going to roll up and whiff. In that same game against Jonathan, I charged a warrior into his condemner, the sniper, and I died in my own activation.
Oh, that's horrible.
And I was like, okay, sometimes that happens.
All right. So I've got one more question for you now, Ben. I want you to tell me. It can be this could be it could be a treat, it could be a drink, it could be a whole meal, but something that you just particularly enjoy during the holidays. Any one of those things.
Ooh. Well, I have a bit of a sweet tooth myself, so I'm going to go with a drink dessert, specifically hot cocoa, right? So everyone has had hot cocoa. It can be anything from, pre-made in a packet to like a decadent custom recipe. I love a good cup of hot cocoa, especially as we get, towards Christmas time and, the weather's starting to cool down a little bit. Having that warm, cozy hot beverage for dessert is perfect.
Really good. That's the first hot cocoa we've gotten, but
that's crazy.
Yeah, we've gotten a lot of eggnog, a lot of different things, but
okay.
Hot cocoa, that's a good one. I like that. But all right, thank you guys for tuning in and watching. Thank you, Ben, for joining me today.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. It's a blessing to be able to finally come on here and get to talk about some Mandrakes.
Yeah. So everybody, like, subscribe, do all that stuff. If we aren't yet at 10,000 subscribers, please subscribe, because we are just so close. And as always, shout out to everybody over at patreon.com/commandpoint. And guys, tomorrow's Christmas. Spend it with your family, but in the evening, when you have 15 free minutes, go on YouTube and watch the 12th day of Kill Team tomorrow, and it's going to be a good one. It's going to be a real treat. So, but in the meantime, have a good night and happy holidays.
Thanks, everybody. And if you guys are interested in a longer guide, more in-depth guide on the Mandrakes, feel free also to head over to Third Set of Eyes, where we have a more detailed breakdown on the team.
Yeah, and we can throw that in the description as well. So go check that out. All right. Have a good one.